it's hard for me to this day to sort of still comprehend the idea that you could get OxyContin anywhere, but getting treatment is quite nearly impossible for most people. And there isn't even a sort of standard form of treatment. I think in a lot of places in this country, they'll tell you got to go cold turkey. A lot of places they'll tell you got to do methadone, you got to do Suboxone, or you have to do counseling. And it's just, I'm hoping one of the things Dopesick does is like open people's eyes to the fact that some of these treatments really, really do work. Yeah. And we need more of them, not less.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Kristen Donnelly, and I am one of the good doctors of Abbey Research. At Abbey Research, we deeply believe that curiosity can change the world because it's the only thing that ever has. Humans have been asking questions time immemorial. What's over that hill? Do I like this person? What happens if I do this? And that's the way everything kind of changes. So here at Abbey, we try to encourage people to ask questions of themselves and others in a way to build empathy. This series is in service of that. It's called Welcome to My World. And I get this incredible opportunity to talk to fascinating folks who are different than me, which is literally everybody, about something in their lives that if we knew about it, we would have a fuller and richer human experience. And today's guest is absolutely no exception to that. I am joined by Benjamin Rubin, who is a film and TV writer based in New York. His bio tells us that he was inspired by West Wing, which means he's in great company because I even tried to do politics because of West Wing and then discovered that the world is not an Aaron Sorkin show. He worked in speechwriting and communications on a series of unsuccessful Democratic primary campaigns, but and I love this line in the bio that he stated, he soon discovered that the political arena was ironically not always the best forum to address the issues he was most passionate about. And that's what we've discovered as well. The hardest sometimes conversations can happen outside of the kind of weird mechanics of American politics. And we definitely, Aaron and I have talked about how we learned that a lot in Northern Ireland. So he was in an MFA film program at Columbia. During a Q&A, he met Danny Strong, writer of smart and entertaining stories that tackled political, social, and cultural issues, one of which is Dopesick, that we've talked about a lot on this channel, and Ben and I are going to talk about a little bit on here. After working as Danny's primary researcher and assisting in film and television, he was hired as the staff writer for Hulu's show Dopesick. He's a member of the Writers Guild of America East, and he is committed to writing informative and entertaining film and TV drama across many genres that addresses important issues and gives viewers the opportunity to explore different perspectives and experiences, which pretty much means that he's like a soul mate of Abbey Research here. So we're thrilled to death to have him. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Your guys' videos are phenomenal and sort of hit on exactly what we had been talking about through the Dopesick process. So I was very excited to join you.
Oh, we're honored. Well, I love asking the questions that kind of started all. So before you watched Josh and Tony and Toby and Donna, what made you want to be a writer?
I mean, I was always interested in film and television from a young age, and I didn't know exactly what that meant or what my role was going to be. And it was just something that always really appealed to me. And like you said, I sort of found myself falling into politics. I grew up, it sort of came of age in the George W. Bush administration,
Yeah, I think we're probably around the same age. So it's the same. Yeah.
Right. And I think like what happened to a lot of people in the Trump era happened to me in the Bush era, which is I was sort of politically awakened and was constantly experiencing this sense of outrage. And I found myself falling into politics, which... I don't know if, anybody who's worked in politics knows that it's a sort of really chaotic system. And a political campaign is sort of like a startup. And if you are a human being and you are breathing and you are conscious, they will hire you, especially for the kinds of campaigns I was working on, which were, as you said, not very successful. But like you mentioned, I was finding myself sort of increasingly frustrated. There were issues I wanted to tackle, and I was writing when you get those really annoying email blasts trying to raise money from political candidates, that was me. That was my job. And I would write these sort of what I thought were like Sorkin-esque high-minded debates about issues, and they would always sort of be dumbed down to the sort of like petty political arena of the day. I started thinking more about film and TV, and I was seeing that there were people working in that industry who were telling stories about the issues that I thought I had gone into politics to address. And don't hold it against me. My last political job was working for a guy named Anthony Weiner, who
I think I've heard of him. Yeah.
You may have. And when he ran for mayor of New York in 2013, and I believed he had the best ideas, but as anybody who's watching this probably remembers, it was not a campaign of ideas. And it was a campaign about some other things, including his pretty serious flaws. And it was just this sort of moment for me when I realized that this isn't the industry for me. This isn't what I want to be doing. And like you said, I met Danny, and he had just come off of these movies, Recount and Game Change and The Butler. And he was sort of one of the preeminent voices in Hollywood who was sort of tackling like social, economic, cultural, and like racial justice issues in a way that I thought was just really amazing. And I wanted to be part of it. And I think if there's sort of like one movie or one thing that made me want to become a writer, it's not my favorite movie, but it's this movie called Hotel Rwanda, which is a beautiful movie.
Yes. Yeah.
But for me, I remember the genocide, and I remember hearing about it on the news, and I remember learning about it in school, but it wasn't until I saw that movie where I was able to sort of experience someone else's perspective of being there. Like you talk about empathy a lot, right? And it was just sort of this wake up call for me. Like this is something that's able to sort of tell the same story, but break through the news cycle. And so that was sort of the moment, and I haven't really looked back from there.
Fun fact, I actually stayed in Hotel Rwanda when I was in Kigali. So I stayed at the Hotel Mikoline 2 years in a row. It was definitely because they filmed it in South Africa. So it's not filmed. But I completely agree. Hotel Rwanda was seminal for me too in my empathy work. Like the statement that he makes, Don Cheadle is like, why isn't anyone coming? And it's like, well, America's going to feel terrible for you, and then go back to eating dinner. And I was like, right. Okay. That's totally true. So what do we do to inspire actual change? And I came to a similar thing with you, which is stories. And that's really what you've been talking about, is that we don't change our minds through shaming or statistics or political talking points. We change our mind through stories and relationships. And art is such a big part of that. And so I'm not at all surprised that was how you fell into it. So if you wouldn't mind a little insider baseball, what exactly is a staff writer? Like, do you write on every episode? Like, what is kind of the mechanics of it?
TV is one of those interesting things where you look at the credits on a show, and if you're not in the industry, you have absolutely no idea what those credits mean. And I didn't know until sort of pretty recently, because different kinds of producers have the same credit, but they do different things.
Yeah.
And so every TV show is different. There's a sort of fundamental difference between like a 22 episode network series versus something like Dopesick, which was 8 episodes. So we had a small writer's room. It was only 5 writers, which is pretty small by industry standards.
Okay.
And so it's Danny Strong, who was the creator showrunner. We had Beth Macy, who wrote the book.
Yeah.
And she was on the writing staff, but was also sort of really important for the sort of research. And she had been on the ground, growing up in Virginia and living there. And then we had 2 other writers and myself. And so typically there's a sort of hierarchy, which is staff writer is the sort of entry level writer, and then there's multiple sort of rungs you can climb on that ladder until you get into quote unquote producing duties.
Okay.
For us in such a small writer's room, it was sort of the best idea wins out, which was very challenging, but also a really great experience for me. But to more specifically answer the question, the way a writer's room works is your showrunner, in this case Danny, runs the room and sort of leads the conversation, knows where the series is going to go. They typically created the series. He wrote the pilot. And from there, they sort of facilitate a conversation. And we sort of, in our case, spent months talking about the research, talking about the kinds of stories we wanted to tell, the kind of facts we needed to hit, the character arcs. And then we just keep working on it as a group conversation for hours and hours every single day. And so Danny, the showrunner, will then assign an episode to every person. And then so then we sort of leave. So in my case, it was episode 5. And so I sort of break off from the writer's room and I write, the first draft of that episode. And then he goes and he rewrites it and we discuss it together. And so it's this interesting process that is both incredibly collaborative, but also solitary at times. But it's all sort of in service of the vision of the showrunner, who not only is running the writer's room, but is also in charge of the production itself. And so they're keeping this sort of big picture in mind.
It's fascinating. Yeah, that makes total sense. I'm a bit of an like insider Hollywood junkie in that, like, I listen to a lot of podcasts and I try to look, because how the process of storytelling fascinates me. So that's really interesting. It's really, really interesting about the balance between individual and communal. I think that's in some ways you can see that as a viewer. You can see the importance of, like, there's been times I've watched not Dopesick, but other TV shows, and I'm like, oh, that should have gone, like, that joke was a rough draft. That joke should have gone through the writer's room a few more times and things like that.
Right. Well, so the other thing I'll say is that, just quickly, is that there's a real difference in the way we did it versus how a TV show will normally operate, which is a show, typically a network show or a show with a lot of seasons, the writer's room will be happening concurrently with production, which is an infinitely more complicated process. So on Dopesick, we had the luxury, partially due to this really terrifying pandemic we were living through at the time, but also just because of the nature of being a limited series, is we wrote it first, and then we were done writing it, and then we shot it. And so it was great because it allowed Danny to sort of be in the writer's room the whole time, as opposed to having to also be on set, which is typically how a showrunner does it. And so I think we benefited from that, and having really, really polished scripts, and having the sort of time to be able to do that. So
I would have thought that, especially some of like there's some scenes that felt like you wrote them for the actors. So that's really fascinating that isn't the case. So
there certainly was some rewriting in production, especially, as you know very well, the opioid epidemic is not over. It is an ongoing story. More information is coming out literally on a daily basis. I've been researching this for over 2 years of my life full time, and I am still shocked almost every single day by new revelations that come out. And that's happening through production as well. And we were doing interviews, and Danny and Beth were doing a lot of interviews, and sometimes a new piece of information would come out and they would incorporate it into the season. So there was certainly a little bit of that, but mostly.
So speaking of the research, this is not one of those easy shows to write. So I get, like, one of my questions is, were there days where you guys just had to say, okay, we have to like look at something happy in humanity? Like, is there a balance there? Like, I guess the cheap way to say this is, how did you take care of yourselves?
Yeah, it was tough. I mean, I think under any normal circumstance, spending years of your life doing essentially nothing but reading about tragedy, both on the sort of human suffering side, but also on the sort of greed and profiteering on the corporate side, and this sort of whole of government failure to rein it in, it was demoralizing, and it was tough. On top of that, like I said, this was a pandemic. Our writer's room started in March of 2020. I moved out to LA. I rented the tiniest little like studio Airbnb I could think of, because I'm like, I'm never going to be in this apartment. I'm going to be in the writer's room. It's going to be great. I'm going to get all my meals there. And we had about 10 to 15 days in the office before we went into lockdown. And so we were also doing this in isolation. I mean, we were on Zooms like this, but it was tough. But I think knowing what we were trying to do and the sort of people we were trying to do justice, I think allowed us to sort of shine through and power through. But there are also moments, I mean, it's a dark series, but there were moments that were really uplifting and really inspiring, especially in the later episodes when you meet like Sister Beth Davies and Art Van Zee, who are real people. And that's really who they are. And the work they were doing was so inspiring. So it wasn't a completely bleak experience, but it was certainly mentally taxing. And now that it's done, it's to think about something other than opioids for a while has been, frankly, a relief. And not everybody has that benefit. And so I'm thankful for that.
Yeah, there's I think one of the things that was very important about this series, and I laugh a little bit because it's like nobody talked about the Sacklers forever and forever and forever and forever, and now there's been like 3 things this year. There's something coming next year. It's like the deluge has opened between y'all and Patrick Raddenkeef's book and Alex Gibney's documentary this year, and then next year I can't remember the name of the thing that Broderick's in, but like that's happening too. And it's been, for those of us who were part of the conversation against our will for many, many years, but no one talked about it. I think for us, it's a little bit strange sometimes. It's like, oh my God, other people know who the Sacklers are now. Like other people who have no connection to this are now as angry as I am. Like, oh, good to know. But I'm glad that you brought up the privilege of being able to think about something different, because for so many people, you know, if we really do the rabbit hole, millions of people around the world, this has marked their lives irreparably, and there is no thinking about anything else. And so it's really, I hope that people can take solace in the communal thing that is now more people know that this wasn't an accident.
Yeah, certainly not. It was definitely not an accident. Yeah, I mean, we're living in this really interesting moment in time, and I think Dopesick is a part of it. I don't think the show should get all the credit. I mean, there were, you know, our work was built on the sort of years and even decades long struggles of activists like Nan Golden, Organization Pain, prosecutors and journalists. But it's all seemed to converge now, which is you know, gratifying for us to see that we were at least a part of this conversation. And, you know, just in the last few weeks, I mean, like sort of mountains have been moved in terms of this, like, you know, years of waiting, like the name coming down off the Mets, and this really sort of like fantastically unjust bankruptcy agreement and immunity deal being overturned, at least for the time being. I mean, you know, it's not happening in a vacuum. And I think the sort of increased public consciousness of what's going on has played a role.
I mean, and that's what art does, right? It increases public consciousness in a way that is both it should be both activating and motivating, and also kind of in a certain way comforting. Like Dopesick is not a comfortable show. I don't mean that, but there is comfort in it, in that there are solutions for people. There are ways forward, and we're not alone. Like Bridget, none of us are Bridget anymore, where you're just screaming into a void of nothing and no one's listening to you. There's a lot more folks going forward.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, there is a lot more work to do.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And, you know, I think Purdue Pharma and the story of OxyContin is sort of foundational to the opioid crisis, but it is not the totality of the opioid crisis. Other pharma companies sort of saw what they were doing and said, if they're doing it, then we can too, and sort of opened the floodgates, which transitioned to a heroin crisis, which is now a fentanyl crisis, which is infinitely more lethal than it was even just a few years ago. And so, you know, this is one of those stories, I think, like the war on drugs itself, that has no easy resolution and may not end. But there are things that can be done, like I think we've been seeing recently, and hopefully we'll see more action that'll hold people to account. And so that's our hope. But it's, you know, Dopesick as, you know, a limited series is not meant to be the totality of the crisis. It's a sort of window into the origins of something that's even more complicated.
Absolutely. And it's important that you bring up the kind of prescription opioids to heroin to fentanyl, because obviously in the timeline that you guys were telling, fentanyl wasn't really on the American radar. And so that, you know, couldn't be part of 2006. You know, that wasn't a huge part of the radar. But even the different kinds of heroin that have come out of this, and the ways that different mafias from different parts of the world have gotten in on it and have preyed upon American teenagers. And it's very, like, I feel like every time I want to talk about it, I'm Charlie from It's Always Sunny and I've got my murder wall. Like it's a monster. It's an absolute monster. But changing the subject just a little bit, kind of on a more human side, I'd love to know, like, what was your favorite part of this process?
My favorite part of the process, it's a good question. I mean, for me, my my background for sort of years prior, even when I was working in politics, was essentially a research background. You know, when you're working in politics, you're researching policy and trying to craft it into ideas. And when I was working in the film industry before I became a writer, it was the same thing. And so for me, my favorite part was the most satisfying part, I think, which was being able to take and distill what are, by any measure, infinitely sort of complex, nuanced discussions and being able to turn them into a narrative that I think people understand.
Yeah.
And it sort of goes back to what we were saying about Hotel Rwanda, right? It's like, I think everybody more or less knew that there was an opioid crisis. I think a lot of people had heard of OxyContin, a lot of people had heard of Purdue, but the facts that we were able to sort of reveal to people and open people's eyes to these stories is so satisfying to me. I mean, I have friends, family, acquaintances, people I barely know have been reaching out to me throughout the series. Certain sort of moments that happen in the show, like the Porter-Jick study, which allegedly proved less than 1% of people get addicted, is not a study, as Time magazine called it. It's not a landmark report, the Scientific American called it. It's a freaking letter to the editor. And the fact that this elaborate game of telephone was able to happen, where you have an unscientific sort of passing thought as a letter to the editor becoming something that is taught as this foundational science in medical schools, prestigious Ivy League medical schools. Yeah. They're in medical journals, and that pharma companies can take to create a myth that the FDA then believes that their drugs are not addictive. I mean, for that to happen to me is stranger than fiction, right? Yeah. And it's, I think in a writer's room on a show, if I had pitched that idea in a world of fiction, I would have been laughed out of the room, honestly, and maybe fired, because it's too patently ridiculous. And so for us, being able to take something like that, put it into a series, and then for people to be outraged by it and understand it, for me, is the most satisfying part. Definitely.
Yeah, that was one of those things. I knew it was coming, and I was waiting. I was watching Erin watch the scene where they figure it out, and I was like, oh, she's going to be so mad. And she had to like lean forward and pause the episode and like march around our hotel room. I was like, oh yeah, welcome. Like, yeah. It's just the worst. Yeah. And what, you guys weren't able, there's just so much you did as much, but to tackle the moral side of that argument, and that because it was allowed to become this lie, that addiction wasn't a medical issue. For the last 50 years, it's become an entire conversation about morality. And that has prevented recovery for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people and families. I mean, I just think like one of the kind of, so my factory, for anyone watching this, is I co-own a manufacturing factory in the neighborhood of Philadelphia that is affectionately referred to as Heroin Alley. And it's like a couple blocks from here. We're right by Kensington and Allegheny, for people who know Philadelphia or know the war on opioids. And it's kind of like common knowledge around Philly that a lot of death certificates aren't filled out properly. Like if it's an overdose, they'll come up with something else because they don't want to, especially if it's suburban kids, they don't want to shame the families. So there's like, I graduated high school in 2001. And I remember in like 2002, 2003, there was a slew of opioid deaths that were all listed as heart attacks. And people were like, well, how is this healthy 17-year-old having a heart attack? And I'm like, they were probably at a party and took this thing that no one really educated them about, because we can't talk about it. So we can't teach people about it. So we can't do anything about it. But for me, that's one of, as a empathy educator, as a human, as a former pastor, like the morality argument is the thing that I think will take even longer to undo, even after the Sacklers, Purdue is out of business, which someday, knock on all the woods, will happen. Even after all that other, it's this hangover of, well, addicts are bad people. It's Richard Sackler saying, hammer the addicts. That's the true hangover in a certain way. And that's the thing that still just drives me nuts because of that stupid letter that, I mean, and that poor guy, he was just like, I wonder if, like, it's not his fault at all, but it's the mechanism. As much as we claim that academic publishing is based on peer review, it's really not. No one checks things. And it's really, yeah, I was so glad that you guys were able to unpack it in the way that you did, and really show Rick and Randy, the boy band of justice, as we call them, digging into it and really finding, because yeah, if they hadn't, this whole thing would be different.
Yeah. So I think what you're talking about, I totally agree with. And first of all, that sort of stigma and shame, I mean, very much still exists. I mean, there are, I think actually you mentioned on one of your prior episodes, like you can still look at obituaries and see sort of what are clearly opioid deaths and overdoses.
Oh, absolutely. Yep.
Hold something else. And it still very much happens. And so I think, you know, this is sort of part of what for me is so truly sinister about this story. It is in sort of infecting the sort of medical community in this country and around the world with this idea that you're talking about. You know, it's willpower. It's you know, and sort of creating this stigma and sort of trying to refute any of the sort of scientific notions that go into like what opioids really do and change your brain chemistry. They create this sort of stigma and shame through communities, which, as you're saying, in turn results in an inability to collect accurate data.
Yeah.
Right. So if they don't know for many years and still to a certain extent to this day, like we don't really know how many people have died, and we know it's a lot more than we think. And there's the scene with Bridget in the series where she's trying to put together this study, and it is so difficult for her to do that because these deaths aren't listed as overdoses.
No.
Because it rooted in something that Purdue helped sort of start, which is this shame and stigma, hammer the abusers, as you said. And so also, you know, that sense of shame and stigma that is, I think, getting a little bit better, but still really, really widespread in a lot of communities is something that was really, really important to us. Maybe the most important thing to address in this series. I think, you know, a lot of portrayals of addiction in various mediums, it's as the villain or, you know, as someone who has a, you know, is not a likable character, or it's somehow their fault or they're weak. And so for us, it was really important, especially through the Betsy and Finnick stories, to show that this is just normal people, and the addiction and the way their brains are changed is horrible, but it comes with this sort of shame in your community that can make recovery all the more difficult. So that was
one of the addicts that I love the most, I'm the who's in recovery now and that I'm closest to, he talks all the time about how isolation is what keeps addiction going. And so the true, like, terrible, ugly, perpetual cycle of what Purdue did is that it kept people in isolation. That true recovery happens within community, because you can't really, your brain is your own worst enemy. So you need people around you to be truth tellers. And I thought about that a lot with Phoenix. I thought about, like, that particular individual was really forefront of my mind, and a bunch of others. I mean, I've been to far too many funerals from this thing. And that's not even the people I have the privilege of loving a lot of people in recovery from a lot of different things. And it's one of those things that I wish so many of them still need to keep it a secret for various things. They feel they'll be stigmatized in their job, or they'll think, I have somebody who, if they deeply feel if their husband knew how bad it had gotten, he would divorce her. And I'm like, but you've been clean for 10 years. And they still don't feel like they can be fully honest about what was going on. And that stigma is so, so massive, especially around, I'm glad you guys touched on methadone.
Yeah.
And what that can possibly, and we now even have Narcan, which is a controversial thing in the Northeast and in America entirely, which is something that law enforcement can carry, and now social workers, and here in Philly, librarians have it, where if somebody accidentally overdoses, there's a nasal spray that can restart your heart really quickly. But all of that is controversial. Needle exchange programs are controversial. And we have not even touched on the school to prison pipeline or the racial makeup of opioids in particular, and all of those kind of things, that now as pot becomes trendy, we need to have harder conversations about other drugs and this war on drugs that may or may not have worked depending on who you talk to.
Yeah. I mean, it's what's so crazy to me is that methadone and particularly Suboxone are still wildly controversial. And something we did in the series, which is unfortunately sort of still true in a lot of places today, is, you know, you can get, especially in the era of this story, you could get OxyContin basically almost anywhere, either legally or illegally. But if you wanted treatment, if you wanted methadone, sometimes you would have to drive hundreds of miles, and you have to go every single morning, 5, 6 in the morning, sometimes 7 days a week. And it's impossible. Now, Suboxone is easier because it's a prescription, but it's still every month. It's still tough.
And a lot of insurance companies won't cover it. So like we've got some class issues in there too. And
yeah. And there are these sort of caps on how many patients doctors can take, and they have to go through certain training. And and so for us, showing and it doesn't work for everybody, these medicated assisted treatments, but they do work for a lot of people. And so for us, showing those things, methadone through the Finnick story, and then Suboxone was really important because, as the original OxyContin, propaganda ad people said, it'll let you get your life back. And it's really important. And so something just on the topic of methadone really quick, something that I'm really proud of, which is a really, really small moment in the series, but I'm really glad we got in, is when you see Finnicks go to the methadone clinic, it's not like a methadone clinic I think like a lot of people picture. It's not like you see in a lot of movies and TV shows. I think people picture a lot of prisoners and like hardcore people with tattoos, but in reality, it's like blue collar workers, it's construction people, it's lawyers, it's it's
college
parents,
professors,
and students, and it just looks like a normal waiting room. And these are people that are literally getting their lives back. And so for me, it was really important to show, there are like kids on the floor in that scene and, playing with toys. And this isn't some sort of gross back alley thing that we need to sort of push away. I mean, this is something that works. And if anything, we need more, not less. But anyway,
definitely need more. Yeah. When I lived in a town in Central Texas for a couple of years, and one of the methadone clinics was like next to a coffee shop. And it was one of my like favorite things because I knew somebody who drove a lot of students to get their methadone, and he would just sit in the knockoff Starbucks and have his coffee while they were going to get their absolutely disgusting red juice. So the face that Michael Keaton made, the perfect face when he drank that thing. It is gross, but it is better than anything else. And I think we'll wrap up soon in honor of your time, but which you've been so generous with. But I want to draw out this idea. It doesn't work for everyone. I love that you just said that. One of the problems, I think, heretofore with the opioid crisis, and this is for life. I mean, this is toxic wellness culture. This is toxic diet culture, that like there has to be one solution that works for everybody. And this is because of the insurance companies, honestly, and the privatization of medical care in the US, that like this is the solution. And if this solution doesn't work for you, then you're hopeless. And instead, what we need to do is just throw open the doors and say, here are all of the possible options. Let's figure out a way to get you the right cocktail of hope to move forward if you want to. And the narrow lanes that we've forced some of these folks into is abusive on society's part.
Yeah, extremely. And I mean, to this day, for me, it's almost like the climate change debate, which is like, I mean, the science is pretty good. It's pretty settled, but we still, especially people, from one end of the political spectrum. I mean, I just this morning, I was reading some politician sort of raging about needle exchanges, and we don't want those people in our community, but those people are already in your community.
Yeah. And you probably went out to dinner with one of them last night. So,
yeah, exactly. And it's just, it's remarkable to me that it's still a sort of county by county, local decision by local decision. And a lot of times it's, as Beth Macy writes in her book, she has an upcoming book called Raising Lazarus, which is really great, by the way. And she, it's going to be great. And so she writes a lot about this, and on the ground in these, especially these rural communities, when the government simply is unwilling or unable to act, and what ends up happening is you have these sort of like local community groups and, often churches and nonprofits that are putting together sort of like under the radar needle exchanges and counseling services and connecting people to doctors. And it just, it's hard for me to this day to sort of still comprehend the idea that you could get OxyContin anywhere, but getting treatment is quite nearly impossible for most people. And there isn't even a sort of standard form of treatment. I think in a lot of places in this country, they'll tell you got to go cold turkey. A lot of places they'll tell you got to do methadone, you got to do Suboxone, or you have to do counseling. And it's just, I'm hoping one of the things Dopesick does is like open people's eyes to the fact that some of these treatments really, really do work.
Yeah,
and we need more of them, not less. That's
absolutely.
the hope, at least.
And I think that's a beautiful hope. And yeah, just the making something illegal doesn't make it go away. It doesn't prevent it from happening. It makes it more dangerous. And that's pretty much true across the board. It's true for pregnancy termination services. It's true for needle exchanges. It's true for a lot of things. Making something illegal doesn't necessarily make it go away. It might just make it more dangerous. And that's certainly the data that we do have on needle exchanges and on condom distribution and on abortion and things like that. So,
yeah.
Well, Ben, thank you again so much for your generosity. I'm very curious, what's next for you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I am very much committed to sort of trying to stay in this lane of telling stories that are sort of deal with these sort of like larger issues that are important to me. And I'm sort of dabbling in a few things. It's a tough business and you never really know what's going to happen. But I will say that I am in the semi-early stages of working on something that is a fictional story, but rooted in research like Dopesick is, that is about the climate crisis and the sort of collision of politics and science, which I think is sort of one of the defining issues of our time. And you look no further than the pandemic for that. But I will say that we don't have any word yet on whether or not Dopesick is going to come back. It was meant as a one-off limited series, and so time will tell. But if it does come back, I would no matter what else I'm doing, I would come back for more, but no, I have no official word on whether that's happening or not. But
oh my gosh, I just assumed that we wouldn't get it and that I would have to, chase Beth Macy's next book. So that's
the story. Sorry to interrupt, but the story ends in 2007, and as you very well know, there is a lot more story to tell. I think there is a sort of sense of finality in the Dopesick finale. We cut to 2020 and you see sort of Nan Goldin and the protests and some of what's happened, but it's, there's a lot more to tell. For me, the thing is that after the guilty plea in 2007, the Rick and Randy, case, Purdue doubled down. Their sales went through the roof and they took these illegal tactics all around the world, and it didn't stop for another 10, 15 years. So whether or not there is more Dopesick or not, I'm very invested in the story of the opioid crisis and whatever form that would be. And yes.
For sure. And I mean, we'll cover it. And if you guys want to have a conversation about some of my thoughts and feelings on the cottage industry of teenage rehabs, please let me know, because I have a lot of thoughts and feelings. But it has been an utter privilege for this time. Thank you so much. I learned so much. It was so great talking to you. Ben, where can people find you on the internet?
I was a social media recluse until very recently. I joined Twitter to mostly just tweet about Dopesick. So I am at, I really should have known this coming in. It's at Benjamin_Rubin at Twitter, I guess is how you say it. I don't know.
Pretty much. Yeah, you're doing great. You're doing great. We'll make sure it's in the show notes. And so everyone, if you would like to learn a whole lot more, I'll tell you the entire staff of Dopesick is very active on Twitter, retweeting some things that are going on, updating things, connecting you to some other activists. So even as you guys watch this in January 2022 and onward, I mean, Ben and I are talking in December of 21. Who knows what has happened by the time you are watching this? So definitely hop on Twitter and find out what the updates are. And if there's other big cases, obviously, Abby Research here on our YouTube channel, we will keep you updated. If you are here for the first time today because you know Ben, then welcome to the channel. We have an episode by episode breakdown of Dopesick, as we've been talking about before, but also a whole lot of other conversations around where pop culture can teach us about humanity. So we have coverage of The Handmaid's Tale and The Crown and Unbelievable, which is Caitlin Deaver's last incredible performance about morally ambiguous political things that we need a lot more eyes on, and that one, it's sexual assault. And so I think she might have a cottage industry of just telling hard stories. Anyway, we have a lot of stuff on here, and if you're looking for slightly lighter fare, feel free to find our Hallmark Christmas movie analysis as well. Happy to bring that structured joy. In the meantime, I would love for you to do all the YouTubey things on this video. Please like and comment, subscribe if you've liked this conversation. I have a lot more like them. I'm incredibly lucky. Ben, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And again, thank you, both of you for doing these Dopesick videos. Like I said in the beginning, the sort of things you're picking up on and the stuff you guys are talking about is almost verbatim what we were hoping people would pick up on. So we, all of us, on behalf of the entire Dopesick writing staff, thank you very, very much. And we look forward to seeing the finale episode.
Oh my gosh, it's filmed and ready to go up in a couple of days as we talk. So we're anxious, and I will definitely, we'll pursue our next career as clairvoyance, it sounds like. So that's really exciting. Awesome. Everybody, my name is Dr. Kristen Donnelly. My guest has been Benjamin Rubin. This has been Welcome to My World, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.